good evening and welcome to World Today, which is indeed your window to the world. I'm Gautam Roy. In the next 1 hour, we'll get you updates from all different corners of the world. The latest that is going on in Glasgow, of course, where it seems that the climate conference COP26 could be extended beyond the time that it was set for, which is to end today. Why is that happening? We'll tell you all about it, but first, our headlines. Second COP26 draft document published on Friday morning weakens the language used in the first draft to address the phasing out of fossil fuels. Language has been changed at other key points on emission cuts and climate finance as well to enable its acceptance to all parties. After nearly 2 weeks of talks, countries at COP26 remain at odds over a range of issues, from how rich nations should compensate poor ones for damage caused by climate-driven disasters to how often nations should be required to update their emission pledges. Leaders say time is running out for a concrete action plan, but differences persist. China's Communist Party passes resolution amplifying President Xi's authority, adopts the third historical resolution in its 100-year-old history, enshrining current leader Xi Jinping place among the party's tallest leaders. With winter approaching, the pandemic situation in the US is still precarious. COVID-19 cases continue to rise. Cumulative count exceeds 46.8 million, with the death toll approaching 760,000. Experts fear a new round of resurgence could hit the US as winter approaches. Big-ticket film and OTT releases in the offing as e-buffs look forward to a bouquet of animated period and comedy treats in days ahead. Animated musical Encanto, Hawkeye and Jane Campion's Power of Dog are set to hit the screen soon. Let's now begin with the big news that is all coming in from COP26 in Glasgow. The negotiators at the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow were locking horns on Friday for what is scheduled to be the final day of the bargaining over how to stop global warming from becoming catastrophic. A new draft agreement has been put out, which dilutes the language of the first draft on key points like phasing out of fossil fuels, emission-cutting targets and climate finance. This can only serve to make agreement all the more uncertain and long-drawn. Take a look. After nearly 2 weeks of talks, the almost 200 countries represented at COP26 remain at odds over a range of issues, from how rich nations should compensate poor ones for damage caused by climate-driven disasters to how often nations should be required to update their emission pledges. A new draft document published on Friday morning weakened the language used in previous texts to address the phasing out of fossil fuels. The new draft included 2 words on fossil fuels that dilutes an earlier draft, which had boldly stated that the world should pledge to stop subsidies for fossil fuels in general and phase them out. Arab nations, many of which are big producers of oil and gas, had objected to the fossil fuel wording in the earlier draft. Now the text includes the word unabated before coal and the phase out of inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. The paragraph now reads, COP26 calls upon parties to accelerate the development, deployment and dissemination of technologies and the adoption of policies for the transition towards low-emission energy systems, including by rapidly scaling up clean power generation and accelerating the phase-out of unabated coal power and for inefficient subsidies for fossil fuels. Unabated essentially means countries could continue to use coal if they are able to capture large amounts of the carbon dioxide they emit. The concept is controversial as the technology to fully capture greenhouse gases is still in development. Adding inefficient in the context of subsidies just leaves that part of the agreement open to interpretation. The other key differences are, while the first draft of the agreement urged countries to come back with stronger emission-cutting targets by the end of next year, the new one merely requests them to do so. And while the first draft noted with serious concern that money provided to developing countries to deal with the climate crisis was insufficient, the latest draft omits the word serious. The issue of who should pay for the impacts of the crisis has become the main sticking point in talks. The Glasgow conference set out with a core aim to keep alive the 2015 Paris Agreement's aspirational target to cap global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels to avert the worst impacts of climate change. The new draft agreement, drawn up for the UN Climate Summit in Glasgow on Friday, presses countries to be more ambitious in their plans to tackle global warming, but also walks a fine line between the demands of developing and richer nations. While retaining its core demand for countries to set tougher climate pledges next year, the draft is a balancing act, trying to take in the demands of both climate-vulnerable nations and large economies reliant on fossil fuels. The retention of a pledge for countries to upgrade their climate targets in 2022 will be welcomed by poorer nations which want more action to tackle worsening floods and wildfires and rising sea levels. However, the weaker language compared to the previous text and failing to offer the rolling annual review that some developing countries have been advocating in loud earnest could prove to be a deal breaker. World Today Desk, DD India. We're approaching the final day of the two-week COP26 UN Climate Summit, delegations intensified efforts to strike a deal to tame global warming with a focus on finding cash to help developing nations cope with its worst impacts. Developing nations want tougher rules from 2025 onwards after rich countries failed to meet the 12-year-old pledge to provide $100 billion a year by 2020 to help them curb emissions and tackle the effects of rising temperatures.
Protesters on Thursday sounded a siren call from across the river to the negotiators at the COP26 Climate Summit, calling on them to prevent a climate breakdown. Climate Call-Up set up a red siren across the River Clyde, where the two-week United Nations meeting is coming to an end. Climate Call-Up founder Ben Carey said the siren's aim was to alert the world and leaders to the failure of COP26. Britain's COP26 President Alok Sharma on Thursday said that strengthening collaboration between governments and non-state actors is absolutely vital as the UN Climate Conference concluded its penultimate day. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres echoed Sharma, saying that governments, non-state actors and civil society need to hold each other accountable to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. British COP26 President Alok Sharma on Thursday stressed that time is running out to complete negotiations on critical climate policies before the UN-backed summit closes. On the penultimate day of the summit, Sharma, who was appointed as president for COP26 in January this year, impressed upon delegates and journalists that there was still a lot more work to be done.
Now look, whilst we have made progress, and I want to acknowledge the spirit of cooperation and civility that's been demonstrated throughout the negotiations by negotiators and ministers, we are not there yet on the most critical issues. There is still a lot more work to be done, and COP26 is scheduled to close at the end of tomorrow. So time is running out.
However, Sharma maintained that the target to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 Fahrenheit, was still within reach. Guterres said he welcomed the US-China agreement announced on Wednesday. US climate envoy John Kerry and his Chinese counterpart Xi Zhenhua unveiled a joint declaration late on Wednesday, in which China, the biggest producer and user of coal, promised to accelerate its transition from the dirtiest fossil fuel. The agreement between the world's two biggest greenhouse gas emitters boosted hopes that the almost 200 national delegations can toughen up their collective commitments by the time the end of the summit on Friday, the 12th of November.
Governments need to pick up the pace and show the necessary ambition on mitigation, adaptation and finance in a balanced way. We cannot settle for the lowest common denominator. We know what must be done. Keeping the 1.5 goal within reach means reducing emissions globally by 45% by 2030. But the present set of nationally determined contributions, even if fully implemented, would still increase emissions by 2030.
Guterres warned that promises ring hollow when the fossil fuels industry still receives trillions in subsidies.
But promises ring hollow when the fossil fuels industry still receives trillions in subsidies as measured by the IMF, or when countries are still building coal plants, or when carbon is still without a price, distorting markets and investor decisions.
He also announced the creation of a group of experts to propose clear standards to measure and analyze net zero commitments from non-state actors.
Beyond the mechanisms already set out in the Paris Agreement, I've decided to establish a high-level expert group to propose clear standards to measure and analyze net zero commitments from non-state actors. The high-level expert group will build on existing work and submit a series of recommendations to me during the course of next year.
During his speech, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Chief Patricia Espinosa focused on the importance of solidarity to help those vulnerable communities whose reality keeps getting worse and worse. Approaching the final day of the two-week summit, delegations intensified efforts to strike a deal to tame global warming, with a focus on finding cash to help developing nations cope with its worst effects. A first draft of the COP26 Accord released on Wednesday implicitly acknowledged that current pledges were insufficient to avert climate catastrophe and got a mixed response from climate activists and experts. With a new draft expected in the coming hours, climate finance or help for poor nations most vulnerable to floods, droughts and rising seas triggered by global warming is central to the negotiations. Host nation Britain says the overarching goal of COP26 is to keep alive hopes of capping global temperatures at 1.5 degrees Celsius, 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels, still far from reach under current national pledges to cut emissions. World Today Desk, DD India.
Now, as negotiators thrash it out in Glasgow, time is running out for many populations across the globe in terms of finding answers to the catastrophic impacts of climate change. Rising sea levels in Tuvalu are already forcing people to move to other parts of the island nation. To them, climate change is now, not tomorrow or day after.
The forced migration of people from the tiny Pacific nation of Tuvalu due to climate change is only a matter of time, said a campaigner from the island. Climate change is expected to drive migration to new levels, with disruptions to food supplies, water security, and increasingly severe weather extremes in the coming decades. The effects of rising sea levels are already being felt in Tuvalu, causing the internal displacement of people to other parts of the island, campaigner Meina Talai told Reuters at the COP26 summit.
Climate change in Tuvalu, related sea level rise, it's not just the waves breaking our shores, but also we are experiencing the inundation of the mainland, especially water bubbling right in the middle of the island, especially on Funafuti. So it really challenges our agriculture sector and our traditional way of planting, our indigenous way of doing things.
Talai, who works with the Tuvalu aim of the Climate Action Network, said he feared its population would have no choice but to leave the island as the effects of climate change intensify. He said COP26 should result in substantial financial contributions to aid vulnerable communities in loss and damage caused by climate change, as well as measures of mitigation.
If Morrison and also other neighboring countries want to keep us out of their doors, they really need to do something. They really need to come up with a strong, ambitious plan to keep us afloat and survive.
Climate migrants do not qualify for refugee status under the UN High Convention for Refugees, which leaves people driven from their homes with little or no protection when they land, with governments often seeing them as illegal aliens. In the 6 months between September 2020 and February 2021, 10.3 million people were displaced by climate-fueled natural disasters, more than 4 times the 2.3 million displaced by conflict during the same period, a report by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society said. The question of historical responsibility has loomed over COP26, where developing countries are pushing rich nations to provide more funding to help them find alternatives to fossil fuels and adapt to climate change. So far, the money has not arrived, complicating the efforts to curb global warming, as some developing nations say they cannot afford to cut emissions faster without more financial help. World Today Desk, DD India.
So the sense of urgency is there for everyone to see, feel, but things are not working out right now as they should. In Glasgow, to talk about it all, we have Anil Kumar Thrigunai joining us, well-known former senior diplomat, often on DD India. Pleasure to have him again. And Suruchi Barwal is also with us, Director, Earth Science and Climate Change of TERI. She's joining us from Glasgow. First, let me bring you in on this, Suruchi, because we would like to know what is going on in terms of the negotiations at this stage over this new second draft, which many are seeing diluting key points, but sticking to some of the ones that are still contentious.
So I think the draft that was circulated lacks largely in ambition that we can see, and therefore, because as you know, in your initial few points that were flashed in your news, the negotiations are still continuing and the polishing of the text is still on. So we're waiting for the end of the day today to see if there's some refinement in the text and there's some ambition that's put into the text, because right now, if you look at the various heads and what is being reported under the various heads, whether it's related to adaptation, mitigation, or loss and damage, the text basically stands loose in many parts, and therefore basically shows a lack of world vision and ambition to do anything about the issue.
Right. It also tells us that will is missing, and there's a lot of tug of war going on. Anil Thrigunai, do you feel hopeful that this will be resolved? It's already the last day, and some people are saying that COP26 may need to be extended further as well.
So normally,
I was trying to bring in our other guest. Hold on a second, Suruchi.
No negotiations that may happen.
Could you hold on a second, please?
No negotiations that basically conclude. They do extend, the COP by a day or two. And what we are foreseeing is possibly they may continue to have the discussions and negotiations on the text on Saturday as well.
Okay.
And we don't know whether they will include Sunday also as part of that.
Okay, just hang on. I was trying to bring in Anil Thrigunai on this as well. Mr. Thrigunai, what do you feel? Are you optimistic that things will be worked out, or do you feel that COP26 might end up in something that will not really go down too well in the pages of history?
Well, Doctor, I mean, this is a sad state of affairs, frankly. I mean, as you know, they say that the buck stops where the bucks are. And that's the problem. I mean, these countries are unwilling to provide the requisite funding for green technologies, for mitigation or for adaptation or for any kind of work that needs to be done in the developing world. I mean, that is the biggest problem. The problem of haves and have-nots will continue to be there. This is exactly the same story that happened at Rio, that happened at Paris, and that happened at Glasgow. We have agreed to 1.5 degree. Okay, you can make statements, but what are the concrete results that are going to come? How to achieve is the biggest problem. I mean, that is the problem, as Prime Minister Modi said, about $1 trillion are required. And it was committed $100 billion long ago. Nothing has come out of it. Whatever little came out for some countries added to their debts. So I don't see much is happening anywhere, because even the China and US have signed this whole agreement or the mitigation on that aspect. But you have seen what happened to China recently as far as its energy crisis is concerned. India has also had the similar kind of problems. So the countries have their own transitional path in which they will go, especially the developing world. They need to be supported. And I don't see sufficient commitment to that at all. Everybody, there is a rain of frankly uncoordinated responses, statements. And as Prince Charles himself said, they are very fine statements, but we need to see the fine action by the countries. And who's going to take the first action? I mean, who's going to bail the cat? Essentially, the big countries that are the big polluters, about 80% of it comes from G20 countries mainly. Now, how is it going to be done? You have shown the case of Tuvalu. I am reminded of a case where the former President Nasheed of Maldives hosted his cabinet meeting underwater to really show several years ago. So the situation is getting worse, and it is today that we need to take the action. So I think that they need to, because Glasgow COP26 need to come up with some kind of a statement and some kind of a document. They will come out with some kind of a document. But I'm not quite sanguine about the fact that much will come out of it, especially as far as 1.5 degree target is concerned.
Right. Now, let's talk about specifics as far as the second draft is concerned, Suruchi, because it talks about, it still talks about phasing out coal, which is a good thing, because that, if it stays in the draft, is also unprecedented. But when you put in unabated and then on subsidies, you say inefficient subsidies on fuel, then it becomes a little wishy-washy, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it doesn't basically get into the nitty-gritties of how do you get this done. And, for these transitions that we're talking about, where is the support going to come from? Where is the alternative technology, going to come from? And what kind of technologies are we going to talk about? Because when we look at the finance part, the statements there are also, lying loose. So whether we're talking about, support for adaptation,
finance, emissions, everything.
Damage, but also on the mitigation side in terms of where, the technology needs the finance for basically installing new technology, which may lead us towards a cleaner path. The support for clean energy. There's no clarity on that, while they've hinted on the subsidies part, which becomes like home ground for countries. For example, if India uses a lot of coal and of course has subsidies, this is one area definitely we will have to look at. But then how do we look at it and what are the alternatives? I think the text doesn't basically get into the details on the kinds of support that countries can get for this transition or transformation that we're talking about to move towards a cleaner path or achieve the 1.5 or the 2-degree goal that basically we are all aiming for.
Right. Now, everybody has to pull collectively, but it seems, Anath Rugnayat, the way it's working out overall, even in diplomacy, where we see that multilateral bodies like the UN and all, their effectiveness has been questioned. This is also a multilateral effort, a summit-level effort of over 200 countries, and it may or may not work out, and it ultimately might boil down to countries who have complementarities bilaterally or in plurilaterally figuring out the best way forward for each other.
Well, these are global problems and they need global solutions. And there has to be, of course, we know the North and South divide is very much there. The developed countries and developing countries divide is there. Some kind of technology apartheid is very much there. And therefore, we know that this is a problem of 2080. 80% of the countries need some kind of an assistance. And that is extremely important. But at the same time, since these are global issues, they require global solutions. And that's why this is an important platform. And we need to continue to talk. Because at least what is happening is globally, everybody has identified that the action needed to be taken now. But at the same time, individually, certain countries, most of the countries will have to move forward, whether it is in the fossil fuel category or otherwise adopting green technologies. Like, for example, India, which is dependent on coal for a great percentage of its energy.
Yes.
However, at the same time, it has decided that it will increase its targets, emission targets, and reduce it from 35% to about 45% by 2030. It will increase its renewable energy capacities by about 50%. So those are the things that are going to make immediate impact. And of course, there has to be funding available for a large number of countries, without which I don't see that we will be able to achieve the targets. And it is not the target. We are actually killing not only ourselves, but we are killing the planet for the posterity.
Certainly we are. And Suruchi, in terms of what are the essentials for India, what is India negotiating for? Can you fill us in on that? Because we heard the Prime Minister when he was there saying that the world must aim to put together $1 trillion for climate finance. That is definitely not happening. But in terms of negotiations, what are we saying? It must be there in the draft, otherwise it's a complete deal breaker for us.
Yeah, so India started with very strong statements, with Prime Minister Modi giving a commitment for net zero for 2070s, and then of course scaling up our ambitions for 2030 under its NDCs in terms of the renewable power and the energy efficiency levels, etc. But following that, when the negotiations started, it was very clear from India's point of view that until we are provided assistance, the finance to be able to help us to implement what the goals that we've set out for ourselves and the technology, access to the technology, it would be very difficult for India to meet its goals. And that's where the critical points are. You may make these statements which may be huge, large statements in terms of what you aim to do, but if you don't work out the nitty-gritty, the fine lines in between how these have to be achieved, it would be difficult for any country, including India, to actually end up doing anything, with regard to the targets that we've set for ourselves, whether in the near term or the long term.
Yes.
And therefore, the world needs to understand that they have to work this out on how they're going to get this done, so that at the end of the day, we are all moving towards the same ambition and contributing in terms of protecting the earth.
Certainly, and India is not a lone voice, is it, Amrit Raghunath? We have different collectives at different levels. We're speaking for all developing countries. We have like-minded countries, and we have other countries as well working along with us with similar goals in mind. So that adds heft to what we are seeing at COP26, and maybe we can hope for some positive outcomes on those fronts.
Well, India has always stood, as you know, as a G77 country or a leader of the NAM, and always, whenever there were negotiations, India has not thought of itself alone. India has been the voice of most of the countries in the world, especially the developed world, and it has been a reasonable voice. And I think that on the climate change, very often we in China are on the same page. So there are many countries in the world who support India's stance. But at the same time, that's the reason that you are talking of differentiated responsibilities. And it cannot be the same kind of, as this is the debate between mitigation and adaptation. I mean, that's what Prime Minister also brought out. So this is extremely important, that the climate targets are actually contingent upon financing availability, and the technologies availability is as simple as that. I mean, but the problem is that the most of the Western countries are not willing to take on the larger cards, or for that matter, there's no point. I mean, you may say, okay, we'll do so and so, but how many countries have achieved it? India has achieved and even outdone itself of its Paris climate agreements and the conditions it has imposed upon itself. It has done much better than that. So whatever we had agreed to, we have done that. And we are helping other countries as well in sustainable manner. I mean, not only that we are not doing it, whatever we have, but at the end of the day, there is a threshold from beyond which you do need the latest technologies to be able to make any significant difference.
Right. And this, of course, is a demand for a large part of the world, because it's developing as well, Suruchi. So do you feel that on the technology transfer front, something positive might emerge in a collective sense, that it will be put down in black and white as to which kind of technologies and to what extent will they be shared, and if there's a price to it, how is that going to be negotiated?
So somehow it's not only the negotiation here in Glasgow, but negotiations that have happened on technology transfer before also. I'm a bit surprised that governments have not ensured that the private sector is engaged very closely in the negotiating process on technology, because these technologies are not housed by governments.
Yeah, they're patented by private companies mostly.
Private sector and the industry, and therefore a close engagement with the industry and the private sector in the whole negotiating process to see what can be put on the table. Because normally when you look at the private sector and the industry, they basically have copyrights and on technologies that they own, and industry doesn't just want to share it because there's a profitability attached to their businesses.
It's intellectual property.
We need to bring the other stakeholders in the process to see how this can get done, to what extent can people put things on the table, and then how is it that it can be shared, and and information be passed on to other countries, to also make sure that they are also performing at the same levels, or basically are able to use those technologies to achieve the goals that we are setting out for ourselves. And that part is very weakly stated in the negotiating text. It's basically a loose statement on technology transfer without the stakeholders actually coming forward and saying, this is what we put on the table, with the help of which we can achieve the goals that we are talking about.
Anant Raghunath, before I say bye to you, because I'm being told that you need to go elsewhere, we've seen some amount of private sector being brought in, particularly when it comes to switching to electric vehicles. We've seen Ford and GM give some undertakings, but others have not, global manufacturers like Toyota. But even on other fronts, say about energy transition, private sector has been brought in. To some extent, things are happening, but not to the extent desired.
Well, as you know, the direction is there, very much so. I mean, Tesla, like, for example, you mentioned, and even Toyota has, yesterday only I read, has done something with another group and came out with a new car or something like that. So they are all trying to do that, but at the same time, you know, the technologies have to be through the whole value chain process or the production process or in the day-to-day sustainable practices that are going to be introduced. So there has to be some kind of a national requirement. I think the technology bank and the internationally there ought to be some place, and there, if it is to be a multilateral effort, then obviously it has to be pooled in there, and that's what the funding is required. Green funding for that purpose is required for that. So I think that the countries, especially the ones who can afford, and unfortunately the biggest polluters are the richest, and they are the owners of the technologies.
Yes.
So I think there has to be certain moral aspect dimension to it as well. Whether through public-private partnership or otherwise, I think they need to work closely on that.
Certainly, and thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Trigunath, to talk about what is turning out to be perhaps a long night for climate negotiators. And Suruchi, you're there. I'll request you to stay on because we would like to talk about some other things as well, then come back to you. Because what's been happening is that just how would the world look like if humans don't arrest the rising mercury levels? Well, an NGO has tried to provide answers with the images of how various cities will look like in that particular scenario. Take a look.
Dramatic images released by NGO Climate Central have predicted what the world cities will look like if global warming rises beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Climate Central said it developed the images after peer-reviewed research on the long-term sea level consequences at different stages of global warming. The 2015 Paris Agreement commits countries to limit the global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius. Scientists have said crossing the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold risks unleashing far more severe climate change effects on people, wildlife and ecosystems.
With 1.5 warming, we can probably save most of the great global cities on the coast over time. We will have time because sea levels won't rise as quickly, they won't rise as much. With 3 degrees Celsius warming, we're going to see so much rise that probably 50, our analysis found more than 50 major cities on the coasts worldwide will face situations requiring either unprecedented defense or requiring abandonment. And we're going to create that situation of skyscrapers in the water.
Preventing temperatures from reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius requires almost halving global carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2030 from 2010 levels and cutting them to net zero by the year 2050, an ambitious task that scientists, financiers, negotiators and activists at COP26 are debating how to achieve and pay for. Already the world has heated to around 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Each of the last 4 decades was hotter than any decade since the year 1850. The difference between 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius would help limit sea level rise to a few feet by the end of the century, still a big change that would erode coastlines and inundate some small island states and coastal cities. But blow past 2 degrees Celsius and the ice sheets could collapse, scientists told Reuters, with sea levels rising up to 10 meters, though how quickly that could happen is uncertain. Warming of 2.7 degrees Celsius would deliver unlivable heat for parts of the year across areas of the tropics and subtropics. Biodiversity would be enormously depleted, food security would drop, and extreme weather would exceed most urban infrastructure's capacity to cope, scientists said. World Today Desk, DD India.
So that's how disastrous it could look. Hollywood CGI coming to reality completely in all our lives, and that is what we might be facing if things are not brought under control. And Suruchi Badwal is still with us, Director Earth Science and Climate Change. Terry, and with us from Glasgow. Suruchi, completely disastrous scenarios, of course, we've seen all that being played out at different levels. We've seen how efforts have been made to show what might happen later on, even now. But it seems that right now the warnings are falling on deaf ears. Not enough is being done. And when will we know, what is the outcome of this entire process at COP26? Will there be a final draft ultimately at the end of the day today, or there will be an extension? We'll go into further negotiations for another day or two?
Yeah, I think the scientists have been quite good at in terms of conveying the message, in terms of the risks that are likely, the directions in which we are moving, with the kind of changes we are, observing and would be observing in the near term and the long term, with different projections, different scenarios that they have been discussing over the years. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has constantly been bombarding with information related to climate science and its developments over the years. And we are right now, last year early this year, we had the release of the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC, which again highlighted the threats that are real and yet again being experienced, and that many of the things that people were thinking would be something we would be experiencing in the future in many parts of the world. We're already experiencing the frequencies, intensities of these events striking us again and again, and of course
extreme climate events,
livelihoods and infrastructure. Huge amount of losses that we are experiencing. And discussions with negotiators, policymakers have been continuous over these years. The COP meetings have happened every year, and my sense is many of them are aware of the kind of consequences we are talking about. So when Climate Central basically showed a visible model, maybe it hits you more hard, but ideally many of these things have being told year after year to people who are negotiating and the policymakers within countries who are dealing with this particular topic and coming on the negotiating table. So they're very much aware. But at the end of the day, we see a clear mismatch between the time frames when we're talking about these changes and changes being experienced. So we basically want to do something that may help us in the near term, some things that may stretch over to the medium term, and some things that you may need to take cognizance of in the long term, maybe 50 years, 70 years from now, so that you're following a path which leads you to to reductions on one side, which may help in terms of reducing the consequences, but also helping to adapt and cope with the current crisis that we all experience. But politicians and policymakers seem to be, when they come for the negotiation, seem to be short-sighted. With the objective of just looking at the terms that they are basically going to serve within their countries, whether it's a 4-year period in some countries or 5-year period in some countries, basically looking at what is in it for them to basically negotiate and achieve in the next 5 years.
Okay.
And if they were able to get away with that without giving a firm commitment,
right?
Then they feel that they've achieved something by not giving that commitment, and it's actually very pathetic and a sorry state of affairs to see that there is such short-sightedness on an issue that is global, of a global nature, but has huge local consequences to each one of us across the globe. It's not going to help people come and negotiate here and see what is the limit and where is the limit they can draw, because at the end of the day, it is each country, each one of us getting affected, and the costs are being paid by individuals on the ground already, with the disasters that we're experiencing. Who's bearing the losses? Infrastructure being lost, people dying, who's losing their families? And that reality has still not sunk in. So you're not coming here to negotiate to protect your country boundaries and what best deal you can take back for your country. You're here to negotiate to protect the world as a whole that we all occupy as space and home. And that environmental thinking in terms of why we are collected here, I think it's missing, because what countries come here and do, they're basically trying to see what is the best deal they are able to take away.
Yes.
Where is it we can negotiate the best and get away with some decisions which may put a less burden onto them, and things like that, which is ridiculous discussion and negotiations. Because at the end of the day, we are not here to look at our own self-interest, because we're looking at the larger interest of the planet.
But that's not happening, and you're sounding pretty bitter and angry right now. But I don't know if as the negotiations can ensure that some better sense prevails. Maybe you never know when people meet and it is happening in the physical mode, which is, I think, a better thing than just doing it online. Things might work out. There can be some pressure points that go beyond the inflection point, and maybe we could see some agreement. I'm still not giving up hope.
Yeah, there was a lot of expectation from the Glasgow COP. One, it happened after 2 years. And there was a lot more preparation than maybe the previous COPs, because this particular COP had a longer time frame. And then of course the UK presidency, a lot of hope from the UK presidency to have strict agendas in the document, which would basically tell countries in terms of different targets, goals that they have to achieve, and
yes.
which right now, at least in the draft text, we see is missing.
Okay.
And therefore we do hope that it turns out to be a stronger text than what we see. If UK doesn't take the lead, my hunch is it will be very difficult for the world to achieve the goals we are basically setting for ourselves. Of
Yes.
course, Europe also pushes the climate agenda very strongly,
Mm-hmm.
but UK has always been, the front runner.
Okay. Well, let's hope. Let's not give up hope at this stage, because this is where you really have to take a call, and maybe a call for the larger interest, the better interest of the world might be taken. We can certainly expect that. Thank you so much for joining us for the moment, Suruchi from Glasgow. Okay, now Egypt has been officially selected to host COP27 UN Climate Change Conference in 2022. The country's environment ministry said on Thursday. The North African country will hold the conference in the Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh. At the closing plenary of COP26 in Glasgow, Egyptian Environment Minister Yasmin Fawd said Egypt's priorities as host would be climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage. Now, China's ruling Communist Party has approved a rare resolution on Thursday elevating President Xi Jinping's status in its history in a move seen as consolidating his authority and likelihood of securing an unprecedented third leadership term next year. The resolution on the party's achievements and historical experiences since its founding 100 years ago was passed at the end of a 4-day closed-door meeting of more than 300 top leaders on its Central Committee. It puts Xi on the same pedestal as Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, two previous leaders who cemented their position as preeminent leader, with the only other two such resolutions being passed in 1945 and 1981. At this week's meeting, known as the Sixth Plenum, the party elevated the role of Xi in one of its ideologies by crediting him for the first time in an official document as the main innovator behind Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Now let's talk about the COVID-19 situation across the world as well, where the cumulative total of confirmed COVID-19 cases in the US is exceeding 46.8 million now on Thursday, with the death toll approaching 760,000 according to data released by the Center for System Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. Specifically, the country's case count rose to 46,839,695 on Thursday, and its death toll reached 759,602. With winter approaching, the pandemic situation in the US is still not quite optimistic. In fact, it remains precarious. Over the past 2 weeks, the new confirmed case count was up 25% in the Midwest, 18% in the Northeast, and 4% in the West, according to a report by CNBC. Several experts have suggested that a new round of resurgence could hit the US as winter comes. Experts say that compared with last winter, People are becoming much less cautious as the use of masks is getting lower, which would lead to the rise of infections in the winter. Polish Defense Ministry released footage of guards at the Belarus-Poland border on Thursday. Border guards filmed the migrants gathering near the fence and could be heard shouting, "Go Belarus, this place full." Most migrants in the border area remain trapped between Belarusian and Polish security services, enduring freezing weather in makeshift camps. Poland has reported at least 7 migrant deaths in the months-long crisis, and other migrants have expressed fear that they could also die. Critics of the Polish government say it is treating migrants inhumanly and not letting them apply for international protection. The government says the migrants are Belarus's responsibility as they are legally on its territory, and offers of humanitarian aid have been refused. Large groups fleeing conflicts and poverty in the Middle East and elsewhere started flying to Minsk this spring with the help of Belarusian travel agencies. Many have traveled to the border with Poland, Lithuania or Latvia and tried to cross into the EU, sometimes using wire cutters they say were given to them by Belarusian border guards. Western members of the UN Security Council on Thursday condemned Belarus's handling of a migrant crisis along its border with Poland, saying it demonstrates how the government of President Alexander Lukashenko has become a threat to regional stability. Estonia, France, Ireland, Norway and the US and Britain held a closed-door meeting of the 15-member body on Thursday to discuss the migrant crisis. Walt Disney's latest film Encanto celebrates Colombia's diversity, its people and its music, and sends a message about overcoming challenges, said singer and composer Carlos Vives. Encanto helps rehabilitate the image of Colombia, usually associated in Hollywood with drug trafficking and violence. Encanto is Disney's 60th animated film. The title track for the film, set to be released at the end of this month, is Colombia Mi Encanto. Encanto tells the story of the Madrigal family, which possesses special powers and lives in a magical house in Encanto, a town hidden in Colombia's mountains.
A lot of stairs, but at least I'll have a friend. Nope, he flew away immediately. Quitter!
Actor and filmmaker Kenneth Branagh takes audiences to the city of his birth and his childhood with the semi-autobiographical comedy drama Belfast. The mainly black and white film centers around 9-year-old Buddy and his family, who live in a working-class neighborhood of North Belfast where everyone knows one another and Protestants and Catholics live side by side. Set in the autumn of 1969 at the onset of Northern Ireland's troubles, 3 decades of conflict, the 60-year-old filmmaker said he wrote the screenplay during the first UK COVID-19 lockdown in the spring of 2020. Since winning the People's Choice Award at the Toronto International Film Festival in September, Belfast has become an early Oscar frontrunner. Belfast opens in US cinemas on the 12th of November, which is later today. And Christmas came early to London's trendy Hoxton neighbourhood on Thursday as the stars of the new Marvel Studio and Disney Plus series Hawkeye launched the show with a festive fan event. Actors Jeremy Renner and Haley Steinfeld walked a Christmas tree lined and faked snow-covered red carpet as guests sipped hot chocolate among traditional wooden stalls before sitting down to watch the first 2 episodes of the upcoming show. Hawkeye is set in the aftermath of Avengers Endgame, with Barton getting ready to spend Christmas with his family. Hawkeye starts streaming on an OTT platform on the 24th of this month.
The world's greatest archer.
The past has caught up with me.
Should we be worried?
No, it's nothing. I'll be home for Christmas. I promise.
It's the most wonderful time.
When I wore this suit, I made a whole lot of enemies.
You're a Hawkeye!
Who the hell are you?
Some people have actually called me
And Jane Campion's The Power of the Dog has been a riveting film festival audiences as it's toured the globe's film festivals from Venice to Tenerife to Zurich to London, and on Thursday it arrived at the AFI, or the American Film Institute Film Festival, with all its cast. The film has been predicted to be a mainstay during award season for both director Campion and the story's lead, Benedict Cumberbatch, who famously stayed in character as a cowboy in 1920s Montana. Cumberbatch plays the domineering Phil Burbank, whose world is turned upside down when his brother George brings home a new wife and her teenage son. His character sets out to bully the two newcomers into his life. The Power of the Dog will go on limited release in theatres on the 17th of November before streaming on Netflix on the 1st of December. Well, music and love unite all people, surpassing boundaries of caste, religion and regions in ways no other stream can possibly achieve. And Mariah Carey, the so-called Queen of Christmas, is back this season with another new song, the holiday gospel ballad, Fall in Love at Christmas. See how the Queen of Christmas